Susannah Winslow came out to a dry, sun-cracked prairie county where every sensible soul broke ground for wheat, and put her whole cheap creek-bottom claim into the one crop a body cannot plant nor plow nor pray up out of the sky, winter ice, and the settled folk of Ledger Springs took one look at a young unmarried woman cutting blocks of frozen creek water in January to sell in July, and decided, before the first thaw, that she would have a shed of muddy water and a ruined name by summer, for everyone knew a slip of a girl could not fill an ice house nor keep a pound of it through a prairie August. She did not know yet that before a whispered lie and a store-book debt could take her ground and her father's old craft from her, the quietest man in that whole county, a sawyer who had scarcely said a dozen words to her, would set his own 2 hands and his own hard winters against the whole district to make her ice pay, and to keep her. It had begun with a death and a long road, and a keepsake carried 1,000 miles. Susannah was northern-born, from a cold lake country up in Maine where a man measured his winter, not in bushels but in the crop he cut off the frozen ponds when the ice grew thick and blue. Her father had been the best iceman on his lake, a patient man who could tell by the ring of his saw and the color of a block the very hour the ice was fit to store. He died the winter a new company put the little cutters off the lake for good, and Susannah came west with the last of nothing, only the knowledge in her 2 hands and her father's long ice saw wrapped in an old quilt, its blade worn bright and thin from 40 winters, and its applewood grip gone dark and smooth with the oil of his hand. She took up a cheap creek bottom quarter section no wheat man wanted, low ground along a clear spring-fed creek that pooled wide and deep behind an old beaver dam. The men who ran that country did not trouble to hide what they thought of a girl and her ice scheme. Cyrus Denby, who kept the store and the district's credit, told her plainly that cutting creek ice was a lazy Yankee's notion and a poor woman's ruin, that there was no trade in cold a body could count on, and that when her ice ran to slush he would carry her on the book so long as her creek bottom was good security and not 1 week longer, and Elmira Goss, who set the moral weather among the settled wives. Let it be known that a young woman out on a frozen creek in men's boots with a saw in her hands was not what a rising district meant to have in it, and that the Christian thing was to talk the poor creature into wheat before she starved. The pity in it was the settled, comfortable kind, and it had teeth. She would haul her sledge past whole families at their wheat and hear them chuckling among themselves in amused disbelief, and she did not once let it into her face. Here is the thing the district had not troubled to learn. Susannah had been raised in the ice harvest the way other girls are raised in a kitchen garden, and she knew what not one wheat-proud man on that flat had ever thought to know. That clear ice cut thick in the dead of winter and packed close in sawdust will keep sound and cold in a dark house clean through the hottest August, that a country with no cold in July would pay dear to keep its meat from spoiling and its butter from going to oil, and that the clean creek behind her beaver dam froze clearer and sweeter than any water a body could haul. And she kept one thing above all her trade dear to her, her father's long ice saw, its blade worn bright from 40 winters, and its handle dark and smooth with the oil of his hand, and she meant, the first evening she hung it on its pegs by her shed door, that the old careful craft it stood for would not die out of her family on a wheatman's say-so while she had 2 hands to work it with. And none of her care would save her ground, for the country ran on credit, and the credit ran through Cyrus Denby. A district mortgaged to the one dry crop lived or died by the wheat, and Denby, who lent against next year's harvest and took the land when the harvest failed, had grown broad and easy, buying out the failed at his own price. and had a particular eye for that clear creek bottom with its deep cold pool, worth 3 of any dusty wheat quarter if a body knew what to do with water. He had no wish to see a woman prove there was money in a thing he had marked for his own. So when Susannah let it be known she would fill an ice house and sell coal cheap to any neighbor through the summer, and pack the butcher's meat and the creamery's butter besides, a word began to go round ahead of her, low and certain and ruinous. That creek ice was filthy ice, thick with mud and the leavings of the bottom. Foul stuff that would taint whatever it touched and sicken whoever trusted it. It cost the men who passed it nothing, and it meant to cost her everything. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is saved by luck or by a fortune fallen out of the sky, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever hard season they have been handed. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then draw your chair up close and stay with me, because Susannah is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people a county is quickest to write off are so often the very ones with the most quiet worth in them, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul to see a person whole when the whole country has already made up its mind not to. The man who wanted her trade dead did not cut a pound of ice himself. Corbin Fisk was the agent for a big natural ice company down at the railroad, a smooth, plausible fellow in a fine gray topcoat and an easy, regretful way, who freighted lake ice down from the north on the cars and sold it to the district's butcher and creamery at the company's price, and stood to lose a tidy thing if the district ever learned it could buy good cold off a neighbor for half of it. He did not come at Susannah with a threat, but with a sorrowful reasonableness that was worse, driving out one bright cold afternoon, hat against his chest, to tell her that no one doubted she meant well, but that pond ice off a mud-bottomed creek was a chancy. Unwholesome business sure to sicken somebody and shame her, and that if she would only advise her neighbors to buy the company's clean lake ice like sensible people, he would see her spared the ruin he could plainly see coming. He let that word unwholesome sit gently in the air, tipped his fine hat, and drove off, and behind his smoothness ran Denby's book debt and the whisper both. And it ran through the district like fire in dry grass. It was tidy work. No one had to say the girl had failed, only that her ice would foul, and by the next fall settling she would be starved off her ground. It would go on Denby's book at Denby's price, and the ice saw would go back into a quilt. The silent soul who would see her whole through all of it had been watching longer than she knew. Amos Whitlock was the sawyer of that country, the closest-mouthed man ever to lay a log to a saw, a lean, weather-browned man in his middle 30s with careful, scarred hands, who ran the little water-powered mill where the creek came down out of the hills, and asked so little company that folk took his long silences for sourness. He had come up hard himself, orphaned young and bound out to a hard master, gentled once by an old millwright who took a starving, bound-out stranger off the road one black winter and taught him the saw and the worth of clean work, and he had never after been able to abide a cruelty done to a lone soul who only wanted to work. It was Amos who had heard the whisper against Susannah at the store and said nothing, and gone home up the creek and lain awake. But Amos Whitlock had eyes, and what they told him from the first day he watched her float a raft of clear blocks down the pool alone with her father's bright saw hung by her shed was that the girl the district had written off was no fool, but knew a truth about that dry country the wheat men were too proud to hear. He understood that Denby cared nothing for a neighbor's prospering, only that the creek bottom came cheap, and that Fisk's filthy ice talk was swallowed because it was easier than standing up for a friendless girl. And Amos knew a thing about clear ice, that not one soul on the flat but he and she had ever troubled to learn. That snow is the enemy of a clean pond, that a fall of snow left to freeze into the growing ice makes it white and rotten and weak, and that only a pond kept swept clean through every storm all winter will freeze down thick and blue and glass clear. And he began, lying awake in his mill loft with the water talking under the wheel, to think what a man who lived upstream and kept odd hours and feared no cold might quietly do about a pond and a snowfall, and tell no living soul. He said his piece to her on a cold, bright evening in the fall, when the whisper had got well about and she stood straight and white by her half-dug ice-house, pretending she had not heard it. He stood at the edge of her creek with his hat turning slow in his big scarred hands and said the longest thing he had said to a living soul in years. An ice-house wanted double walls a foot apart and 100 loads of dry sawdust to pack between them, tight sawed plank and a drained floor and a shingle roof to throw the sun, and there was no one nearer than the railroad who could saw them true, and he could. If she would cut her ice and keep her own book and her own good name, he would raise the double walls and roof it tight before the freeze, and haul her all the sawdust his mill threw off that the whole country counted as waste, and she need pay him nothing but the leave to do it. He made the whole of it to the brim of his hat, for he could not have made it any other way. Susannah did not thank him prettily. A girl alone had reason to be wary of a man's easy kindness. But she lay awake that night and understood at last what he had truly held out to her, not charity and not himself, but only that the ice would be cut and kept right, the very thing Denby and Fisk had set out to take from her, and he had offered it without once making her feel small, as a plain matter of good work, owed to good work. In the morning she told him she would cut her own ice and keep her own book and stand her own reckoning and owe him nothing but thanks, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on Amos Whitlock was very near a smile. There was nowhere much for the two of them to be but at the work, and a shared labor has a way of leaking into the heart whether two people will it or not. All that hard bright fall his wagon came down the creek in the last of the light, and every evening when her chores were done she worked beside him, holding the boards while he nailed, tamping the sawdust he hauled, learning the tight double house he raised true and square. When the walls stood dry-packed, and the floor drained sweet, and the roof through the last of the autumn sun, they stood back from it together in the cold blue dusk, and neither of them said a word, and both stood a moment too long looking at the plain good thing they had made. He never once said that he had begun to time his day by the little light in her shed window across the bottom, and she never once said she had begun to listen of an evening for the wheel of his mill to fall silent upstream. And neither of them said one word about the thing that was slowly happening. If you've made it this far into Susannah's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The truest proving of it came with the deep cold. Winter shut down hard on the Ledger Springs country that year. A still black cold that sank week on week and locked the creek from bank to bank, and Susannah's pool, when she went out to score it, froze down thick and blue and clear as a window pane, clearer than any pond had a right to freeze in a snowy country, though she laid it to the clean spring water and was thankful and did not ask further. When the ice stood better than a foot and rang like iron under the axe, she and Amos cut it together in the bitter, shortening days, scoring the field in a checker with her father's saw, floating the great clear cakes down an open channel to the ramp, hooking them up and burying them close in his dry sawdust, layer on layer, till the mocked little ice-house stood full to the plates with a summer's worth of cold, clean, glass-clear ice. She thawed him at her stove after with coffee scalding hot and did not make a fuss of it, for she had learned he did not want a fuss made, but she had never in her life felt so plainly stood by, and the talk between them came slow and then easier. The way a cold room warms once the fire is lit. She found he was not silent for having nothing to say, but for too many years with no one worth the saying of it to, and she found herself telling him things she had told no one. And they both felt the change and were half afraid of it. For a thing begun to save a trade had no business taking root in the heart. It was the old trapper who let the truth slip, and Truman Kell who let it. When the thaw came on and Susannah walked up the creek road one thin bright morning to settle with Kell for the muskrat he'd promised her, the old man who had run his trap line up that creek all winter and feared no man's opinion, squinted at her over his pipe and said, not knowing he was telling her a single thing, that she owed the clear of that ice to more than the spring water, for there had not been one snowfall all that long winter that he had not come on Amos Whitlock out on her pool in the dead black cold before dawn, alone with a lantern and a scraper and a broom, sweeping her ice clean of every flake before it could freeze in and cloud it, night after night, the coldest a man ever stood out in. And it beat him clean, he said. Why a sawyer with his own mill to run by day would spend his whole winter's sleep keeping a woman's pond swept, unless it was for something a man could not rightly put a name to. And then he saw Susannah's face, and shut his mouth 2 words too late. Susannah walked back down the creek road with her ears ringing, and understood the whole of it at last. The quiet man had not merely raised her ice house, he had spent the whole killing winter, night on freezing night, doing the one hard secret labor that would make her ice freeze thick and blue and glass clear. The very clearness that would prove Fisk's filthy ice lie a lie on its own worth. And he had never said a word of it, meaning her clean ice to answer for her so she would never once feel bought or beholden. Susannah, who had been taught too young to ask a thing of anybody, felt something she had shut away since Maine come loose in her chest. That evening when his mill fell silent upstream and his wagon came down the creek, she did not hand him the plank to hold. She took down her father's bright ice saw instead, the tool of the craft his cold nights had kept alive, and set it in his scarred hands and closed his fingers over it and did not let go. And he looked down at her hands on his and then up at her face and did not say one word, and everything was said. But the filthy ice talk was still abroad, and Susannah found she was not content to let it stand. Amos had raised her house and kept her ice clean while the district went on half, believing Fisk's word that her cold was foul stuff that would sicken whoever trusted it, and that she would not have. The ice would keep whatever the country thought, but the plain, honest cleanness of her work and her father's way of cutting a sweet sound block, she meant to prove herself in the open, before the very people who had judged her. So when the summer came on, she sent word up and down the creek that on the day the heat broke its back she would throw open her ice house to any soul who cared to come and see and judge for himself. The summer came on and made her case for her before ever she opened the door. It came in dry and stayed. And then in high July the heat rose up off that flat country like the breath of an oven and would not break, a scorching, weeks-long heat the like of which the oldest settler could not remember, that curdled the milk in the spring house, turned the butcher's fresh meat by noon, and softened the creamery's whole make to running oil. And in the thick of it the thing happened that Fisk had sworn could never fail. The company's lake ice stopped coming. The far northern ponds had cut short in a mild winter, and the ice trains came in light and then came in empty, and the butcher and the creamery and every family that had trusted the company's cold stood in that terrible heat with no cold to be bought at any price in the county. And then Susannah Winslow threw open the door of her mocked little ice house on the mud-bottomed creek. The whole sweltering district drove in the day she opened it, a good part of them come half meaning to see the ice girl found out at last, with Cyrus Denby among them and Corbin Fisk driven over in his fine rig to watch the finish. and they found they had come to the wrong day. They crowded to a house that breathed cold out of its open door like a blessing, and out of the dim, sweet-smelling sawdust Susannah and Amos drew block after block of ice cut half a year gone, and every block came up sound and whole and clear as a window pane, cold enough to ache the hand that held it. One after another the neighbors took a clear block, looked through it at the sun, laid it against their spoiling meat, and paid down their cash on the plank for all to see. The butcher took a load to save his summer's meat, the creamery a load to save its make, and the families who had trusted her, old Ephraim Tozer, first among them, went home with coal for their spring houses and money still in their pockets, and paid their debts down on Denby's own book in front of him. The ice that would foul had kept clean, and the coal that no one would buy was selling faster than she could draw it, and there was no more to be said. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. Susannah only stood by her open door and let the district hold her clear ice up to the light and see which of them had told the truth, and watch the color drain out of Corbin Fisk's face as the cash came down on coal he had sworn was filth. She spoke no cruel word to any of them, and before the murmuring had died, Amos stepped up beside her, hat in his scarred hands, and said, low but plain, that he had done no more than saw a little plank and haul a little sawdust, and that the ice and the craft and the keeping of it were hers by right, and no store-book could touch them, and the clear blocks in the neighbors' hands said the same. So the reckoning went the other way that summer. The families of Ledger Springs paid their debts in ice money and kept their ground, and Susannah settled her own book with Cyrus Denby to the last cent and owed him nothing in the world, and he took it with his face gone stiff and his easy talk of carrying her on the book put clean away. Corbin Fisk drove back to his company, having reached for a trade that was never his to hold and a lie that would not keep, and the company sent no more of him to Ledger Springs before the snow. And the cold went on coming clean and clear out of Susannah's ice house every summer after, and her father's ice saw went on cutting the winter pool in her hand. Amos had stood at her shoulder through the whole of it, and when it was over he turned to face her plainly where any who cared to could see. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said, low, but not so low that Orpha Tozer a step away could not hear it, and gladly tell it after, that he had promised himself in the fall to see her ice house full and her ground safe, and then follow the timber west and trouble her no more, and that he had found he was a liar, for he had no wish to run a saw on any stream that did not have the sound of her sledge on the ice come January. The deceit of the swept pond had been his own doing, he said, and he was gladder than he could say that his own cold nights had made her ice run clear. And Susannah looked at the silent man who had spent a whole winter's sleep out in the killing dark to make a clean thing prove itself, and she did not make him ask her twice. They were married in the first green of the next spring, in the little house Amos raised beside the ice house, the Tozers in the front room and the morning sun coming clean through the tight-set window he had glazed with his own hands. And when the wedding folk had gone, Susannah took her father's ice saw down from its pegs and hung it on the fine bracket Amos had made for it beside the ice-house door, where the low gold light of a summer evening would find the worn bright blade and make it shine, so the old careful craft that a wheat man's say-so could not kill would go on in that country in her hand all her days. She cut her ice every winter beside the quiet man who had put his own cold nights against the whole district to make it run clear, and the wives who had once pitied her sent up the creek to her house for their summer cold, and were glad to. A doubt, it turns out, is the smallest measure of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a country can do is decide who a body is before it has troubled to know them. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. before the lamp burns low, when the whole world has already made up its mind that you will fail, and handed you nothing but its pity and a poor woman's notion to do it with, do you let their doubting and your own hard pride drive you back the way you came? Or do you trust the one quiet soul who will build beside you through the hard season and stand with you into the easy one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.